Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
And this is Chris Jackson. And Fred and I were just talking about one of our favourite topics, which is autonomous vehicles and why they aren't here yet.
Well, I saw something in the news yesterday that Amazon is turned on using drone deliveries, I think in a couple areas in California and I think in Arizona, if I remember right. There's a couple of locations where they're trying to use delivery drones, and it's been active for 3 months, and they've only delivered to 10 households. And it might be, they didn't say whether it was multiple deliveries to those 10 households. Maybe they found just the one house in all of Arizona that is free and clear of obstructions and they can actually get to. So they offer the drone delivery to that house. I don't know. It just sounded like the adoption rate is slow. So what was the discussion at Rams with you were talking about it at Rams with autonomous vehicles? I know that you studied this in the past quite a bit. So what did you find out?
Well, I mean, it's just sort of the age-old back and forth between, the regulators and the regulated and the academics who, I don't know, they like to have their feet in each side. But it's funny how, I think we've talked about this in the past, how the amount of regulation associated with, or perceived regulation, the perceived bar you need to clear in order for this stuff, for these vehicles to be on the road is quite high. It's so high that no one can see it. But do you remember when vaping cigarettes came out, or whatever you call them, vaporizers? I mean, they came out without any research. They were billed as the saving grace for cigarettes. They didn't have smoke, didn't have this, that, and the other. So they were rolled out, and you could see people take them up almost immediately without essentially batting an eyelid. And we know that vapes are not cool, and they're still out there. And it doesn't appear to be the uproar that one might expect that people lead us to believe is going to happen when the same thing happens with autonomous vehicles. So my perspective is that the regulators, this all comes in the regulators. The regulators need to be the adult in the room, and if they are part of the massive children who are throwing food in the classroom, they're already lost. They're not respected. Other children don't respect other children per se. The regulators need to be the adult in the room, and you can let's look at the Boeing 737 MAX debacle with that poorly thought out MCAS system, which led to 2 catastrophic crashes. Yes, Boeing was wrong and bad, very, very wrong. But to suggest that the regulators didn't allow that to happen is just ludicrous. The regulators, the FAA and the equivalent bodies across the world have firstly, made it very, very, very difficult to certify aircraft that are ostensibly a new model, which then sort of motivates organisations like Boeing to try and convince regulators that this is only a slight change to an existing model. And the MCAS is actually a result of that conversation to try and essentially say, this is still a 737. I know it handles completely different, but we'll sneak this MCAS system in there to make sure it handles like all the other 737s, so we don't need to train pilots. So that's the first issue. They motivate poor behaviours in aircraft manufacturers by making it so difficult to certify essentially a brand new plane.
Well, there was something else in the news the other day. It was the Boeing said their next new model was like 15 years away. They were just not, it's so expensive to do it.
Correct. And so you have this sort of, this competitive tension where you want manufacturers are trying to incorporate incremental change into existing airframes because the certification is a lot easier, et cetera, et cetera. But that's one of the behaviours which led directly to poor decision making on behalf of Boeing that led to those two crashes, and not many people talk about that.
Well, I mean, a similar scenario plays out with prescription drugs. It's the
Right.
the drug agencies spend as much or more money trying to get it, through the FDA or the CDC or whoever it is that says, "Yep, you can offer these to people." But it's kind of a good and a bad thing. It's, well, what is the right bar, right level? But I think what you're getting at with the autonomous vehicles is that it'll be qualified when it's good enough. And they're like, all right, well, what's that? How do we actually know what's good?
Right, and essentially, the regulators are saying, well, we're not going to tell you what needs to happen for it to be safe, but we want you to show us everything, then we'll make a determination. And you go, that's just, if I was to summarize it, people might argue, no, there's more than this. And I go, compare that to other regulatory frameworks where there is, like federal motor vehicle safety standards, for example. Let's do that. You need to have a seatbelt. Does it have a seatbelt? Yes. Does a seatbelt stop people from all that stuff? Oh, good. No worries. Seatbelt's good. But when it comes to autonomous vehicles, we have an industry or regulatory industry which is so trained to being risk averse, signing off on stuff with being specific enough to be able to certify it easily by inspection. And does this have ABS? Yes or no? Does this have a seatbelt? Yes or no? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then the same industry is saying, well, we don't know what safe is, but you show us everything you got and then we'll make a determination. And the behavior that motivates in a sort of broadly similar way that it's called aggressive certification requirements on new aircraft have on aircraft manufacturers is that autonomous vehicle manufacturers shut down information sharing, because all they're doing by exposing information to regulators is giving the regulator a reason to say no. And the manufacturer is saying, well, if you can't tell us what it's going to take for you to say yes, you're damn sure not going to get information from me for you to say no. And the regulators just do not understand that or don't want to, and neither do their academics. It's just, and then they complain about regulators not sharing information and information they're putting out as false. And there is merit behind that. Some of the accusations are 100% correct, but it stems from this culture, from this behaviour which they're motivating in our autonomous vehicle manufacturers to be super careful with what you share, because we'll tell you if it's wrong. Can't tell you what's right.
Yeah, no, it's a dilemma that they're in. I know many regulations and many standards, even in the stuff we use for product testing, for reliability and safety and so on, are usually after the fact. Something has occurred, something bad has happened, a committee gets together, they get a lowest common denominator they all can agree on, and it gets rolled out. And usually incompletely is, I can think of a handful of different regulations and standards and so on that really make no sense whatsoever. I've regularly stayed out of the regulatory field because my head would explode with how inconsistent and self-contradictory a lot of these things are. I think another part of this, though, is that the auto safety folks in particular they don't want to define what is good until they have a good read on what's the public perception of what is good. Because if they set it at X level X and they roll out a bunch of vehicles that meet that requirement, and then a bunch of people have really bad problems with it, now they're on the hook. They set the wrong standard. So I don't know how much politics plays a role in it, but I suspect there's some of it. And some of it is we don't know. And another dilemma that could come out of this is that once we set a requirement for autonomous vehicles, we'll realize that people really should not be driving vehicles because they're not really capable to meet this requirement to be safe on the road.
Exactly. I mean, we've talked about it in the past where you had this ridiculous, and I do mean ridiculous, academic website put together, which essentially was polling people, or at the very least asking for feedback on this dilemma. Should an autonomous vehicle, if it has the choice, kill an 80-year-old woman versus a 3-month-old baby? And you go, and the immediate response should be, shut that site down, because we don't train human beings to make that call, which is the standard. That's the standard. To pass a driver's license test, they don't say, okay,
here's your scenario.
Takedown.
Yeah.
And train them to do that. All right, so we're going to go this test track. We're going to put a few dummies up. The correct answer is 80-year-old women. So you got to go through this quarter-mile track at least 60 miles an hour and make sure you take out all the grannies and leave all the babies. I mean, that sounds silly when I say it, but that's the reality when we have this endless academic pondering, which then distracts the regulators. Go, oh, geez, we better think about that. But no one in the regulatory body is coming out and saying just needs to make decisions commensurate with a human being who passes a driver's license test. No one says that.
Yeah.
Got to think about.
Well, that becomes the criteria is if we're setting a standard for this autonomous system to make decisions and operate as well as a human, well, that's a pretty darn low standard.
Yeah. It's not going to get drunk. The ability to modify behavior of autonomous vehicles is extraordinarily high. And this regulatory sort of need or perceived need to make sure we release anything with no perceived risk. Well, good luck with that.
Yeah, we're not going to have it. Yeah.
Right. There's no single federal motor vehicle safety standard which mandated a vehicle feature until after that feature became a standard feature in at least one production vehicle. There's no reason that the only reason we're required to wear seatbelts now is because manufacturers came up with the idea of having seatbelts, and then the regulatory body said that's a good idea. Let's codify that. So they've been 100% reactionary.
Well, that goes with ABS, the automatic braking systems, and
exactly.
And now you see more and more. And I don't know if it's mandated, but the front viewing cameras that give you warnings of lane departure and things like that. I don't know if that's required. I haven't bought a new car in a long time, but
no.
I agree with you. I think a lot of the folks all got together, and the team at Volvo said, "Well, how can we really piss off the rest of these people let's put seatbelts in all of our vehicles. let's make our cars really safe and make them all look pretty bad. Let's do crumple zone in the front. Let's do that, And for a while, that was the sales benefit. If you wanted a safe vehicle, you got that model that had these extra features in it, and that became a selling point for some of the manufacturers. The hard part is that I think there's another layer to this whole issue, is that if you ask 10 different people what's good enough for an autonomous vehicle, some will say, hey, it's good enough right now. I'm looking for that auto taxi, and I'll jump in and go. And others are, no, I need more data. I need more evidence. But individuals, like regulatory agencies, have a risk appetite and certain level of easiness or uneasiness with the whole concept. And so I think that complicates it greatly. There's not an international or national standard for how much risk you should take.
Well, that's where it comes down to critical thinking. So if you go back to the FAA and your comment about, look what happened with the Boeing 737, where it had this non-mandated but clear motivation instilled in manufacturers to try and incrementally change existing models and argue that these are incremental changes. And one of the symptoms of that reality is that, like you said, Boeing's not planning on creating a new airframe for a long, long time.
Yeah.
That goes against everything we believe that a high-tech industry should be aspiring to. It should be constant R&D, constant pushing the envelope in terms of safety and performance and everything else. But if they're not making a new product, a new model until 15 years from now, I mean, that's relatively unheard of. But that's due to in no small part because of the exhausting certification process that the regulatory bodies require these days. But some people might say, well, air travel is very safe because of that approach. And you're not wrong, but this black and white, this is how it needs to be versus this is how it shouldn't need to be, that doesn't work in the real world. You always need to have nuance and critical thinking and direction. And at the end of the day, like we can point to two large airframes which hit the ground and killing everyone on board because, at least in part, of that motivation to try and argue incremental change. Yeah. And that's where the regulator ceases being the adult in the room. They start being the other party slinging mud, because then it turns out that after that happened, Boeing was essentially cozying up uncomfortably with the regulatory body. They then accepted regulatory decision-making on behalf of the FAA. And now you look at two parties where one is just as bad as the other. We say that about children. That's a phrase we say about children all the time. One is as bad as the other. Fukushima, another example, where you look at the TEPCO, the operator, and you look at the regulatory body with regulatory capture. One was as bad as the other. Now we have this scenario where we have, for autonomous vehicles, regulators saying, I don't know what you need to do, but I'll tell you if you're wrong. All right. That sort of sniping, we all know that kid in the classroom. We all grew up with that kid who was, just that sad sack who wanted to point out where everyone else was wrong and failing in life, but had no meaningful contribution to life themselves. That's what you risk becoming when you just simply say, we'll not tell you what we need to see. We'll tell you what's wrong when you do show us, though.
Well, it comes to part of it is it's a big moving target, and depending on what particular group of people are in there and what their, I call it risk appetite is that you'll get a different answer and all over the map. And it's a massive problem. I think regulatory agencies and so on do have a role to play. And
hell yeah.
And yet they're not picking up the mantle of, well, what's good enough? They're not defining that. But I sympathize with that's a difficult objective. But training it to, well, I don't know. I'm thinking of the iRobot books. I'm trying to think. It was it Asimov or Clark that wrote those, the robot trilogy.
I think it was Asimov.
Yeah. He had three rules, right?
Books from Clark.
He had basically three rules. This is what it's got. This is what a robot or an autonomous creature or entity has to have. Do no harm or something like that. It had three rules, and it was built into them, and that made them good enough. They could go do this stuff. But it was. I don't know that we know how to code those rules into an autonomous vehicle. But
you can't. That's the thing. You cannot do it. They will.
Well, it worked in science fiction.
Yeah. Oh God. But all we can do is plan and mature the technology as best as we can in a benign environment, which is what we're doing now, where you have Google has done millions of miles worth of driving on public roads using autonomous vehicles, where there's a driver behind the wheel ready to step in. That data is readily available, at least in California, and the data shows that most of the incidents involve someone hitting that car, i.e. a human being driving another car hitting that car.
Yep.
They're facts. It's not perfect, but the vehicle's not perfect, but it comes a point where you can't mature it anymore in a benign environment or developmental environment, and you have to unleash the beast on the roads, and that's where learning becomes exponential. And that's what we desperately need. We need someone with kahunas to essentially say, we're going to make this happen now. We're going to put in safeguards, but we just need to stop pretending there's no risk involved. But here's the payoff. If we can stop being a government which enables these naysaying regulators, If we become a proactive regulatory body, then that's when manufacturers buy in, because you need to have them buy in, and we give them a reward for good vehicle behaviour. That's when all of a sudden you have a race towards safety. But it's not risk-free, and you can't quantify it. Yeah. It's a philosophy which you see in so many inventions over the years. I mean, look at vaccines. Vaccines are a wonderful way to stop human beings from failing, so to speak. But you and I know how vaccines first came to be. There's some unethical experimentation going on. Let's see what happens when we inject this stuff into this person.
Yeah.
And not saying we need to be unethical, but you can't have a wonderful risk-saving paradigm as a rule without experiencing at least some different or new risk when you introduce that paradigm into the conscience of the public, and we just need to learn from it. That's what we're missing.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I keep waiting. It's coming, and all kinds of cool new inventions and flying autonomous cars. That would be way fun. Go back to the Jetsons in the cartoon.
But autonomous vehicles right now in most countries are going to happen in spite of regulators and not because of them.
Yeah.
And so that means that we'll stay tuned for regulatory bodies to continue this wailing and moaning about manufacturers not taking them seriously, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not going to change anytime soon, because when it does happen, and it's going to happen in spite of the regulators and not because of them.
No, I agree with that. So it's one of those that, from a reliability point of view, I'm thinking, yeah, it's worth understanding the dynamics of all these standards and regulations and constraints and everything else that are placed on us. And some of them are there for really good reasons. Some of them are legacy from ages and ages ago and really dissimilar technologies. And so there's times and place for the regulatory agencies and standards bodies and so on, yet it's not time to check your thinking at the door, and you still need to bring that in with you and consider all this stuff. I don't know. So I remember years ago we were at a table and we asked, would you get an autonomous vehicle today? And I think it was half and half. Everybody that was from the Detroit area said no, and everybody else that wasn't in the Detroit industries, the auto industries, said yeah, sure. And I wonder how that would change today. A number of people that would say they get into it. So if you're listening to this, let us know. Would you get into have you been in an autonomous taxi, for example? Would you get into one? And if not, why not? What's the holdup? Are you waiting for the regulators? That might be a wait. But let us know. Head over to accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. Well, thinking of a different one I just set up this morning. And Chris and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages on the site. So we thoroughly enjoy your input into the show. That's why we're up over 800 episodes, quickly approaching 900 episodes. And a good part of that is because of the feedback we get and comments and questions that allow us to run amok for a few minutes on some topic that is of interest to you. So let us know. With that, Chris, so did your discussion at RAMS come to a conclusion, or is it?
Oh, hell no. Everyone's right.
Well, I'll have to ask you some more about how that conference went next time we chat. We'll let you recover from the trip, and then we'll chat about it some more.
No worries, Fred.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Talk to you again soon.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.